I don't care how many hours you work. I care about how well you work.
Matt Mullenweg is best known as the visionary co-founder of WordPress and the CEO of Automattic, one of the largest globally distributed companies in the world.
If someone's playing solitaire all day, but they're getting the work done, what am I going to say? It becomes about output-based management rather than input-based management.
With no physical headquarters, Automattic currently has around 2,000 employees working in over 90 countries and was recently valued at $7.5 billion. Wow! What do you think are some of the non-obvious advantages of going distributed?
You can hire people that you wouldn't normally be able to hire from companies who aren't distributed. Companies like Slack, Snap, or Facebook are taking people back to the office. So they're kind of going back on their word, which of course breaks trust with their employees, which means those people are very recruitable.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Plugin.fm. My name is Patrick Rolland, and my guest today needs no introduction. He is one of the most prominent figures in the tech world and a bona fide pioneer of remote working. Matt's influence on tech has been far-reaching and revolutionary. It's not an exaggeration to say that his initiatives have quite literally changed the game. In fact, in this interview, I realized that one of my hiring practices I learned from Automattic and had completely forgotten about it until this chat. Based on the intro, you've probably guessed that we'll be exploring the challenges of building a remote-first, also known as a distributed company, and the successes that come from getting it right. Welcome, Matt, and thanks for joining us on Plugin.fm.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
So I think let's just start with the landscape today. In today's day and age, it is not uncommon at all to hire remote team members. But when you started Automattic back in 2005, I think it was pretty novel. How did you make the decision way back in 2005 when it was a different world, a different context, to build a distributed team?
Well, WordPress came first. So I co-founded WordPress in 2003. So I'd been working in open source projects, contributing, and even prior to 2003, involved in online communities, whether that was forums or IRC or Usenet or, that was really, I would say, my primary social interactions, actually. I had friends in person, but I was connecting with my tribe online. And, how open source works then and worked then and works now is very much people from all over the world united by a common passion or goal, working together online. And then the tools were all different. We didn't have as much broadband. We used CVS instead of Subversion or Git. We used SourceForge instead of GitHub or GitLab. So the tools were different, but the basic structure of it was very much like today. Instead of Slack, we had IRC. We had all these different IRC rooms for WordPress. And actually, they're still running on Freenode. You can still visit the hashtag WordPress. A lot of people don't know this, but Slack was actually modeled on IRC. It's basically IRC plus emoji. And so, these early versions of the tools allowed us to collaborate all over the world. And some of the first people who were part of WordPress were all over the world. The co-founder, Mike Little, we had never met in person. He was in the United Kingdom. My first colleague at Automattic was Donico Queeve. He was in Cork, Ireland. So we were already spread out. And, I was in San Francisco by the time Automattic started. I dropped out of college, moved there, taking a job, and was about to leave the job. And I was like, well, San Francisco is expensive. Why would I move people here? Because we had no money. And then, make them leave their families and their friends and, all sorts of things to come to this city, which is, I think, great. But, there's also immigration. Donegal was in Ireland. There's just so many things to worry about. So let's just work where we are. And we got the added bonus, especially in those early days, because we'd all be working so much. We kind of passed the torch throughout the week. So I'd work until midnight when Donica would get up, and I'd give it to him. I'd go to sleep, wake up in the morning. He'd kind of pass it back to me. So there was just a lot of almost relay race that I think allowed us to move a lot faster than our companies who were only working, one shift per day. We were working 2 or 3.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So is it kind of you had the ideal people in mind, and then they were outside of the US? And then because they're outside of the US and you already knew them from your online social presence, and rather than moving them to San Francisco, it was let's just have them be distributed, not remote, distributed.
And not just that, we knew each other. We'd already been working together, doing the exact thing we wanted to do at the company, which is build great software together. So there were some folks in the US, I think where was Ryan at the time? He might have been in California. Andy, I feel like, was in Vermont or Texas, or folks were just spread out everywhere.
Hmm. Fantastic. Would you go back in time and do anything differently with how you started Automattic
That's
distributed?
a good question. What would I do differently? Probably a lot of things if I really thought about it. But it's also that, like, even the mistakes we made were things maybe we had to do to learn.
Hmm.
So myself, and then the fellow who joined as so I hired a CEO about 6 months after Automatic started. My
Yeah.
business soulmate, Tony Schneider. He's actually still involved with the company today, and he was in San Francisco, and so we'd kind of crash, and like if we needed an office or to meet up, we'd either go to restaurants or coffee shops, or just one of our investors' office.
Hmm.
True Ventures was getting started at the time, and so they allowed some co-working space. And actually, it was early. This was kind of before co-working was a thing, but some
Yeah.
of the very first co-working spaces were in San Francisco. So that and coffee shops. San Francisco coffee shop scene is kind of fantastic. We go to
Yeah.
libraries, like just kind of work around the city. The city was our office, or at home.
Lots of entrepreneurs are fans of SOPs, or standard operating procedures. And while those are good for consistency, there are other things that you should do and that you should prioritize as CEO to build that vibrant company culture. Stick with us to learn what you should do for your first couple of hires. Okay, so let me ask you so I think there's some large benefits to distributed work. Like, I think one of the biggest ones is you can hire the best person for the job wherever they are in the world, right? That's probably the one of the biggest benefits of it. But I imagine there are also some non-obvious advantages to building a distributed team. If you have any in mind, can you go into what do you think are some of the non-obvious advantages of going distributed?
Yeah, you can also hire people that you wouldn't normally be able to hire from companies who aren't distributed. So, I actually love that some of these companies like, Slack, Snap, or Facebook are taking people back to the office, including
Hmm.
some of the ones who said you can stay remote forever. So they're kind of going back on their word, which of course breaks trust with their employees, which means those people are very recruitable.
Hmm.
Some percentage of them want to, but some percentage don't. And so
Hmm.
they're going to be on the job market or open to offers that you, and again, these are people you might not otherwise be able to recruit.
Hmm.
Some of the best people you would want to hire are loyal to their company. And so they'll never leave unless the company betrays their trust somehow.
Hmm.
This is why when Elon bought Twitter, it was such a generational opportunity to bring on amazing talent because
Hmm.
some of these people would have been lifers at Twitter. They never would have left. But because their trust was broken, often by being laid off, sometimes accidentally,
Yeah.
they were all of a sudden on the market and you could hire some really great people. We actually hired, gosh, I don't know exactly how many, but like we got like 900 applications. I think we ended up hiring like 15 of them for
Yeah.
Twitter.
Fantastic. I have tried to think about how much remote or distributed matters to me because I've been looking at some jobs, and part of me is like, I think it's at least $30,000 a year. Like if someone was like, all right, Patrick, the exact same job, but you have to go into the office 5 days a week. That's probably at least like it's at least five figures at minimum, probably somewhere
Right.
like 30,000. It is such a big perk. So I can see how you'd use that as a carrot to attract some talent.
And then it might be more depending on the rest of your situation. So
Yeah,
if you're needing to live near, like, some of these tech companies are based in the most expensive places in the world,
yeah,
like,
yeah.
the Bay Area. And then you have to also add in, like, how much is school going to be? Are the public schools good? You have to do a private school. Private school
Mm,
alone could be 30 grand a year per kid.
mm,
you know, um, are you moving away from your family? So all of a sudden you don't have the free babysitting or
yes.
pet care or whatever it is that uh, takes care of your home when you travel. So those sorts of things can add up to where I'd say it could actually be pretty significant.
Fantastic. So since 2005, technology I think was weak originally. So I remember joining Woo Themes, uh, around like 2010, let's say, and we were using Skype for before we got. I think we were
Yeah.
on before Slack. There was HipChat, and before HipChat, I think there was Skype. And Skype is like not meant for like running teams, right? Like I think the
Um,
technology was really weak back then. Technology certainly improved. I think technology is an obvious one, but besides technology, what were the biggest challenges of being distributed in the beginning?
yeah, I think when we started, we were on AIM.
Uh
We
huh.
adopted Skype. What people forget about Skype is that was the time when you used to get charged like per minute on your cell phone, and long
Yes.
distance calls were expensive.
Yes.
So Skype provided, free voice calling to everyone in the world. It's funny, we actually didn't have any meetings before we started using Skype. And then
Huh.
we just do like a voice meeting like once every like couple of months or something. And
Huh.
so every new piece of technology actually enables a different form of work together.
Huh.
Zoom, I would say, for better and worse, since we started using Zoom, we do a lot more meetings because it's just nice being able to see your colleagues and
Yeah.
such. Other breakthroughs, I'd say we definitely benefited from, we were very inspired by the early days of Google. And so at the time when we were starting, people would still, buy like net apps or like multi-$100,000 or multi-million-dollar, like really large servers
Mm.
that were centralized points of failure. Like very famously, there was a big host called Media Temple, it was later bought by GoDaddy. They had these giant, storage servers. They tried to use that to scale. We were of the era, partially because didn't really have any money, where we did lots of cheap servers
Hmm.
in redundant fashion and with really good failover built into our systems architecture. So I remember like the first servers, there was these companies in Texas, like what was it called? EV1 servers or Planet servers, or I forget all the different names, but they're actually in like Houston, Dallas. And they had servers you could just buy on a credit card. They would spin them up immediately. And, they could be as cheap as like 70 or $80 per month,
Hmm.
which was just revolutionary. Um, and so I started actually just even before WordPress started doing hosting,
Uh-huh.
where I was like, oh, my original business model, I think was, what was it? I was like, okay, because I build websites for people and then I sort of
Uh-huh.
sell them the hosting afterwards. I was
Uh-huh.
like, okay, I can charge them $20 a month and I can get 500 people to pay me $20 a month.
Yeah.
That's like, I'm done. I can retire basically, you
Yeah.
know? Because the server was only $70 a month. And
Yeah.
so that would be, call it something like 100 grand a year, which,
Yeah.
as a kid in Houston, that's an unimaginable amount of money.
Yep.
It's more than my dad made. It's more than so that was kind of my whole business model. And it's funny, that's sort of what I do now still. Some of the numbers have changed
Yeah.
but yeah, providing hosting always just felt like a really valuable part of the service. So yeah, I think the cheap servers that were on demand, kind of
Mm.
pre-cloud, um, the growth of the underlying technology like Apache, the LAMP stack, Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP, was nascent at the time, but like, again, not standard. A lot of people were doing like heavy Java stuff or other things, but we decided to bet on these technologies. Shared hosting, we try to make WordPress that ran everywhere, and then later the one-click install and updates. Um, Trying to think what else.
Were there
Communities were already around. Open source was around for a while.
Yeah. How about this? Were there challenges hiring the first couple people? Like, were there, was there challenges in getting those first maybe text meetings on the ground or on the schedule or getting features released? Were there those types of dynamics?
I'd say the first couple were actually the easiest because it's folks I
Huh.
already knew and
Huh.
had already been working together with. And
Okay.
so we liked each other. We worked together. Like we kind of, it was a very known quantity. And so that was just more like, hey, now let's get paid for let's do what we were doing for free and let's get paid for it. That was honestly the original business model of Automattic. Like, hey, let's just try to make enough so we can pay ourselves and work on this full time. Because again, we were doing it for free anyway.
Mhm.
Honestly, if I wasn't getting paid, I'd still be doing WordPress. So
Mhm.
it's one of those things. It's nice to get paid for your hobby. I would say what was much more challenging was kind of the next 30 or 40, so after those first 10 or 15, like scaling the team to a bigger number, we started to hire people that hadn't worked in open source or remote before.
Mm.
We had to hire for, non-engineering roles. um, and, you mentioned not a lot of companies were doing it at the time. There were definitely a few examples. Some like Wolfram that maybe even went back to like the 80s with Stephen Wolfram as like a remote CEO. But not a lot of sort of tech startups. So I would say, one thing that was very challenging was just fundraising because a lot of really fantastic investors had never seen an internet changing company being built in this way.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to invest in the first. They said, you're taking lots of risk building a new thing. You have a new market, a new product, a new everything. Open source is already kind of weird. There weren't a lot of open
Mhm.
source companies. Don't do this weird too. Like
Mhm.
choose one or maybe two areas to innovate in. Don't try to innovate in like 6 or 7 areas at once, which we were definitely trying to do. Like I wanted to create a virtual currency. I was like,
Uh-huh.
It was like 8 things I was trying to do at once. So I cut some of them out, including the virtual currency. Although there's still a credit system on WordPress.com to this day, kind of behind the scenes. But yeah, we kind of picked our battles, which first and foremost was open source. And this idea that if we created kind of an open source community, later even a nonprofit, that was paired with a for-profit, that and created a flywheel effect between them, that they could do something that neither could do on their own, something better than any for-profit could do on its own or any nonprofit could do on its own. There'd be something very complementary there, what Charlie Munger might call a Lollapalooza effect. And then, the remote work, which we called it at the time, later distributed, also felt like a competitive advantage. Again, not just for hiring great people, but also that kind of like 24/7 work. And early days of startup, you really need to move as fast as possible. Your only competitive advantage is speed, because we had less money, fewer people, we had less experience, we had no idea what we were doing. So speed was, I would say, if not the best competitive advantage, maybe even the only competitive advantage we had.
I do feel like iteration is undervalued in businesses. It just seems this is a total tangent, but just moving quickly and iterating on things that you can iterate on. There's some things you can only do once and you try to do it well, but many things in business you can just do over and over again. Your first webinar is not good. Your 10th webinar is excellent by comparison. So I love when companies focus on speed, because you can always get better at that.
Well, and the kids are talking about it now. I think maybe it was Mr. Beast or someone who was like, do it 100 times.
Yeah.
Like if you post 100 videos to your YouTube, I'll look at it. And there's actually like a Zen story about this that I'll butcher, but basically it's a story of, the Zen master goes to two of his students and tells one of them, hey, take 100 days and make, the best vase that you can, or the best cup or something. And he goes to the other one and says, take 100 days and make 100 cups, 100 vases. And at the end of it, who do you think has the better vase? The one who spent like 100 days making one of them, or the one who made 100 of them in 100 days? It's obviously the latter. And the same thing with like learning the draw or whatever. Just doing it repeatedly is undervalued because almost everyone gives up. And so if you can stick with something every day, show up every day with consistency, you'll be amazed what you can accomplish.
No one's going to disagree that it's a good idea to define standards for your company. What might not be obvious, though, is that you want to set really high standards. Matt's going to cover that, as well as other advice from General and Dunwoody. Okay, so moving on. I did want to ask about, so early on in a company, so a lot of the people that listen to this are running their own small software companies. Early on, I think those first couple hires really set the tone for the rest of the culture, right? It's like, from going from the founder to one employee, like that person is like responsible for 50% of the culture. I know it doesn't quite work like that, but they do have a large impact. What sort of processes should you put in place so that you're communicating and collaborating with those first couple hires?
I'd say there's two sides to that. One is humans learn by imitation. And when we're kids and learning to speak and walk, but also as adults, when you enter a new social situation. Just the other day, we have some big meetups coming up. A lot of people haven't been to meetups before. People are sharing that at their first meetups, they looked to what the more experienced people, how they were acting and what they were doing, and modeled their behavior after that. So, it's one of those things, leading by example isn't just one way of leading. It might be the only way of leading. You got to set a good example. And that's regardless, I would say, of position hierarchy. It's more about tenure. As long as those people are still there, if they have a longer tenure, they will lead by example. The good news is, though, that I would say every additional person can redefine your culture. And in fact, hopefully does. Like, hopefully your culture is not a static thing just set by those first few people, that it evolves and expands as you're able to bring in more people and a bigger diversity of people and more roles or specialization. One definition I like of culture is like what people do when no one's looking.
Yeah.
Do they tidy up the bathroom or pick up the trash in the hallway when there's no one there or something like that? And so it's the sort of sum of all of those interactions between every single person and all of the leadership by example that happens there, both in seniority and tenure. And, I really love, one of our board members has a fantastic book. Her name is General Ann Dunwoody. And the book is called A Higher Standard.
A Higher Standard?
A Higher Standard. Highly recommended. It's leadership strategies. General Dunwoody she was the first ever female 4-star in the U.S. military, any branch. And
Wow.
so her story is just really fascinating and inspiring. I actually came across her story when I was studying distributed organizations, because people don't think about it as a distributed organization because the military has bases and everything.
Yeah.
But, her command, I believe, was 60,000 people, like 160 countries. All right, that's way bigger than automatic. It's a more countries and more people. Um, or, a budget was like $60 billion. So it was just
Yeah.
ridiculous.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, gosh, what did the military figure out? Or what did the postal
Mm.
service figure out? Or what did
Mm.
companies with field offices in every city? There's so many examples of this. What did newspapers or journalism figure out when they have reporters all over the world? How they
Mm.
collaborate, how they set the culture, all the things people ask, like, how do you set the culture? How do you know if people are working? Blah, blah, blah. Well, how do you know if your reporter in
Yeah.
Baghdad is working? If you're in New York City, like, well, are they writing the stories? Are they responding? Are they
Yeah.
communicating?
Yeah.
Like, it's kind of similar stuff.
Yeah.
So General Dunwoody talks about how, your standard is also the lowest thing that you accept. I mean, like if you
Mm.
tolerate a low quality of behavior or an exception to your role, that becomes a new standard and a lower standard. So part of setting standards high is, making sure that things are done, the way you do anything is the way you do everything. The
Mm-hmm.
military doesn't have people make their bed and press their uniforms because it's important in battle to have, the crisp or for your bed to be made. But it's one of those habits that is easy to check. And if it's not happening, you also wonder, like, did they clean their gun properly or pack their
Right.
parachute properly or do any of the other hundreds of things that need to be done consistently and with precision for a high functioning organization and individual to operate?
How do you know if someone's a good fit? Like, what are the things that you ask them? What are the things you look for on their resume? Again, once maybe you get past the first 15 people what are
Yeah.
the things that you look for because you want someone who's trustworthy and can move quickly. So how do you dial in on that?
Yeah. I think how we probably, the mistake we made after those first couple of folks is we're like, okay, what do like the big tech companies do, like that we look up to? Like what's Google do? What's, Microsoft do? And so we kind of looked at that. So what they did at the time, to some extent still, is they kind of filter based on resumes or where you went to school, where you previously worked. So a lot of resume based filtering. And they, have pretty extensive interviews, sometimes like 8-10 hours. They'd ask like puzzle questions, write on this whiteboard, like a tree sort or, different sorts of um, brain teasers, how many
Mm-hmm.
manhole covers are there in New York
Uh-huh.
City, sorts of things. That was kind of like from the McKinsey world. So we did that, and we had hired some people that I would say were very impressive on paper, PhDs or stuff like that. But then once we started working together, it just didn't work.
Hmm.
And I also realized, like, hey, I dropped out of college. Like, it's kind of hypocritical of me to only hire like people with fancy degrees. So we kind of looked at like what had worked so well about our initial folks.
Mhm.
And the key ingredient was, regardless of their background, we'd worked together on something real. We'd built something together.
Hmm.
So what we started doing was we still did a little bit of screening. And I actually, would personally screen every incoming application and purposely made it where it was just an email. So people could send the resume in any format. They could format the email from anything. They could send it from anywhere. If someone came in from like a Hotmail, I was like, do they know what they're doing? you know. Um, so I would do that first screen, mostly looking for like attention to detail and writing ability. Then after that, we'd say, hey, let's do a trial project. And how that evolved was, I think, free at first, and then later we'd actually pay everyone kind of a standard rate, like $25 an hour. And because people were like, oh, I don't want to do free work. They thought we were actually going to use the work. We didn't actually use any of the work. We just kind of
Mhm.
wanted to like have something real to try together. And that trial project, we actually is the key part of our hiring process until today. Um, I would say it's also really easy for like engineering roles or customer support. Like customer
Mhm.
support, you can actually give them some real tickets. Engineering, you could pick a real bug. Although now I think we have some synthetic projects we created that, so there's more consistency from one person to the other. It's a little trickier for other roles, like hiring a CFO, what's the trial project, or a business person. But you can kind of figure out some versions of what would be part of their actual job, and they just do it. And you
Hmm.
look at how, and by the way, it's a two-way trial project. So you're
Yeah.
evaluating them. They're also saying what it's really like to work at the company. And maybe they like it, maybe they don't. I mean, it's just as people forget, it's just as important that people really like
Yes.
working at the company and how you work together. And we're fairly unique in how we work together. So that was the thing that we figured out early on, and we still do to this
Mm.
day. It's a really important
Yeah.
part of our process.
I forget. It's funny how things that you did over a decade ago, almost 2 decades ago, are affecting me because I hired someone probably 2 years ago for a role, and we put I think the top like 5 applicants through a trial project. And it's funny.
Right.
I forget how. I forget that these little seeds that you or and other entrepreneurs planted years ago have worked their way into my processes. I didn't even credit you in my brain that was something that maybe you guys
That's awesome
popularized.
though,
Yeah.
because if we open source these ideas and they're successful in kind of the marketplace of ideas, they just become part of the zeitgeist. We don't need
Yep.
credit. Like the reward is just like seeing it happen. Also, credit implies that we were the first people to ever do this, which I'm sure we weren't. I'm sure
Mhm.
probably I picked it up from someone.
Mhm.
There are companies like 37 Signals doing remote, at a larger scale even before we did. And I think that's also really cool. It also means that as more companies out there work like us, it makes things like acquisitions easier. Like
Mhm.
when WooThemes, later WooCommerce, joined Automattic, the team was different, but also like worked in a lot of the same ways that we did. They were into open source. They were built on WordPress. They were a distributed team. Like so,
Mhm.
it was actually one of the easiest integrations of acquisition,
Mhm.
which is the hardest part about the acquisition, um, that anyone had seen at that scale.
Agreed. Having been on the other end of that, it just felt like coming home to big Thanksgiving dinner. It's like, oh, this is my family, just bigger. Yeah.
That's awesome.
So I have a bonus question here for you. We're okay on time. So I feel like Automatic used to have a Matt chat. Is that still a thing where? And I thought it was like later stages of the interview,
Yeah.
or where they and you would basically interview every. Is that every single person? And do you still do that?
Yeah, it was probably the first 1,000 people or
The
so.
first thousand. Okay.
Um,
And what are you looking for in this? Like when, because you're chatting to everyone. You might be hiring an HR person, a finance person, an engineer, a marketing person. What are you looking for in the Matt chat?
yeah. So by the time they got to me, when the match chat was at the very end of the process, we already knew we wanted to work together. It's kind of a
Uh-huh.
two-way thing. And
Uh-huh.
so I would have a number of questions that were just more like getting to know the person.
Huh.
And I would kind of iterate on these and experiment and sort of honed it to like um, somewhat of a, a template or framework that I found could flow really well in a conversation
Hmm.
and would kind of help me learn about the person. They were on text
Mhm.
and asynchronous.
Mhm.
So, sometimes they could even take place over a few days. Also because, at some point, why I had to stop doing it was we were just hiring too many people per week. And I became kind of a bottleneck, and
Mm.
so people might have to wait like a few days or something to get the match chat. And then at the very end of it, we'd sort of like discuss compensation and everything, which was kind of easiest for me because I had access to, all the HR information, everyone's
Mhm.
salary, everything like that.
Mhm.
So, yeah, that was what the match chats were. At some point, our hiring rate exceeded um, kind of what could personally do.
Mhm.
I think in 2021 we hired 71 or 700 people. So that that'd be a lot of match chats. So each one takes an hour or two. So uh, now there's a version of it that's done by usually HR at the end, but I think it's
Mm.
more compensation focused now.
Mm.
Maybe some fit questions or some, they're gathering like time zone, where you are, visas, like all the sort of stuff that HR needs to. They're also
Fantastic.
looking for some culture fit. It was
Yeah.
unusual. There were a handful of people that got turned away at that
Uh-huh.
period, but very rare. And usually we'd use that as a learning, like, hey, what
Yeah.
could we have caught earlier in the process? Because again, we want to be respectful of people's time. So one thing that's
Yeah.
very important to our hiring process, because it would take a fair amount of time for people we hired, is to say no quickly if ever we
Yep.
had indication um, that it wasn't going to work out. So that way we weren't wasting anyone's time, including our own. Although, I would say where we've iterated the most is, before something else that's important to our hiring process is as much of the hiring is done as possible by like the best person in that role. So take your
Mm.
very best engineers or your very best designers. Especially early on, they would review the resumes, do the chats, reach out to people, everything. The good part of that was the potential hires are being exposed to your best folks. The downside sometimes is when we didn't really track. So sometimes the process of hiring would stretch out and we might lose a good candidate, not because they weren't good or a good fit, but because just the hiring process took like 2 months or 3 months.
Yeah. Got it. I okay, so there's a couple things that are important for remote, and I think the two most. So we talked about speed, but I think besides those, I'd say trust and accountability are probably my top two traits that I'm looking for. Accountability of right because you're not seeing them every day. You're not looking over their shoulder to see that their Excel file is open or their coding
Yeah.
IDE is open. And I think just trust with that they're using your time effectively. How do you build that into the culture? How do you make sure that those are two important qualities in your culture?
Would you say those are qualities that aren't important in an office?
I will say those are hugely important in the office as well. But I think there's a belief that the manager can, you can look over someone's shoulder and see that they're playing solitaire and smack them on the fingers with a ruler. I don't know.
Yeah.
I, I don't think that's accurate, but I think it's more important in distributed than in an office.
It's an interesting thought experiment, though, that I think most
Mm-hmm.
of what makes a distributed company great is very similar to what makes a in-person team great or anything. And so a lot of our inspiration, might come from books that could be 40 or 50 years old, like
Mm.
Peter Drucker, Effective Executive, or
Mm-hmm.
some of these business books you can read and then apply the lessons. So just to sort of take that to the nth degree, you talked about looking over someone's shoulder. Gosh, if you have to do that, that's already broken. And if
Yeah.
you wanted to, you could do that remotely. There's companies that install software on their employees'
Yeah.
computers and make sure they're moving their mouse or they record what's on the screen so that they literally are like
Yeah.
looking at their screen in a 24/7 way, even more than you could in an office. Now, I wouldn't want to work for one of those companies, and a lot of people wouldn't, because it does imply that lack of trust.
Mm-hmm.
So the other thing is, even in an office, if someone's playing solitaire all day, but they're getting the work done, who am I to say? I have
Yeah.
colleagues that always have a movie on a second screen just as
Uh-huh.
like background noise. Does that mean they're watching movies all day? Maybe they're
Mhm.
like the Netflix account would look like that, but really it's like noise to help while they work and focus.
Yeah.
So I think it becomes about, and this isn't just distributed, but more output based management rather than
Mm-hmm.
input based management. So again, your customers don't care how many hours you work or what's on your screen. They care about what value you're providing to them. So that's really where we try to look at it. And that also makes it a lot easier. Again, because I
Mm-hmm.
don't care how many hours you work or when you work or
Yeah.
anything like that. I care about how well you work.
So this is actually works out, Matt. I have another question here. So a couple years back, I was at a company and I feel like I lost my manager's trust.
Mm.
And it made me realize I've heard this before, but it didn't feel true to me that you can build trust over years and it feels like you can lose it in an instant. Then
Mm.
because that trust was lost, it was really hard to continue doing work. And sort of over the next couple months, like our relationship just declined and declined. So
Yeah.
I just think it's even more important in a distributed setting where you can't easily see each other's faces and you're not in the office together, you're not bumping into each other. So if in the case where you lose someone's trust, I think some managers like fire him, I'll hire someone new. But let's say
Mm.
it's a good employee and or that's not the tactic you
Yeah.
want to take. You want to keep your employees. How do you get that trust back? Because it seems really hard.
This is probably generalizable to any relationship, right? So, including with a friend or a loved one.
Mhm.
Um, I think first what I go to is just communication because I feel like trust, if I had to make a formula for trust, it's trust equals communication multiplied by time.
Huh.
So when you have really clear communication over a longer period of time, to me, that turns into trust. Clear communication is also like saying like, hey, I screwed up or I did something wrong or setting expectations correctly. Um, Everyone messes up.
Hmm.
And if you're, have a relationship working or personal, whatever, with long enough, like you're going to disappoint each other at some point. If you can talk about that, it's probably better if you can admit it quickly. That's the
Mhm.
best. And if you don't have the common view on it, like if you see it one way, they see it the other way, I think you need to keep communicating until you kind of come to a shared consensus on what happened in reality. I would encourage, if you're talking mostly over text, to try audio or video, or get on a plane, plan a meetup.
Mm. Yeah.
Maybe you need to spend some time in person. And finally, one thing that might help is you know setting conditions for how to rebuild it, and make that a two-way process. Like, you know I feel bad, apologizing is sometimes really important. But then, what are the steps to start rebuilding it? Um,
Mm.
if it's unreconcilable, that probably means that one side or the other is digging in.
Yeah.
Because humans can forget. I mean, gosh, Nelson Mandela forgave his captors. So,
Yeah.
I mean, if he can do it, Jesus forgave his, people who killed it. Like, there's many examples of being able to forgive much bigger things than what typically happens in a workplace. Um, and so, if one person is digging in there and doesn't want to invest in rebuilding it, or it's beyond their ability to, then yeah, you probably do need to start a new relationship someplace else. Maybe that
Yeah.
could be in a different team in the company, but
Yeah.
maybe it also means like a new company would provide you the most, or a new role, a new way of working would provide you the most flexibility. Because it,
Yeah.
it does, you know, it's hard to travel when you have a lot of baggage.
Yeah.
It's hard to travel in life with a lot of baggage. That's why, one thing I feel like really important for like personal relationships is like a statute of limitations. You can't be arguing in 2023 about something, and something in 2017 is brought up, or 2013. At some point, you have
Yeah.
to say, "Hey, we've talked about that. We've resolved that. Like, can't keep bringing it up."
Yeah.
So that's important.
Yeah. So this was kind of in the middle of COVID, and we actually had plans to meet at one point,
Mm,
and then there was some sort of plane drama, and their plane was
mm, mm,
canceled, and he ended up not going to the event, and I went to the event, and part of me, in hindsight being 2020, I wish I pushed him harder to because we did have plans to meet in person. And I think that might have
mm,
prevented the trust break, but I didn't push hard for it. I'm like, well,
mm,
he's the boss. He said he couldn't make it. And I think I'm a big fan of the lesson I'm taking away is maybe I should have been more proactive. And because I know that even if my boss doesn't think he needs it, it's important for both of us to have trust.
mm.
Otherwise, it'll eventually end at some point.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine a long-term relationship without it, right?
Some of the best practices for distributed organizations were popularized by, and you're not going to get this, the Mongol Empire. They popularized concepts like freedom of religion, currencies, and even meritocracy. Stay tuned to learn what else Matt learned and how it applies to remote businesses. There is more inspiration in the world than we think. I think people
Yeah.
look to Automattic as maybe some of the pioneers in remote work, but there are so many other companies that have already done this in other ways, in other relevant ways. Yeah.
Including governments, how governments have
Yeah.
worked, or like you can go all the way back to like
Yeah.
what worked well and didn't about like the Mongol Empire.
Yeah.
Which there's actually a fantastic book called Birth of Modernity. Fun one to read, because what I heard about the Mongols was invading, rape, pillage, all this terrible
Mhm,
stuff.
mhm.
But we didn't actually realize that they came up with some concepts that were fairly new, like the idea of meritocracy.
Huh.
Anyone who was born of any station could rise through the leadership. Freedom of religion, currencies, like a lot of this stuff started or was popularized by the Mongol Empire. And one of the things that people don't appreciate was the communication networks they created. So they were able to, basically through incredible horsemen and relay, like communicate across their vast empire, which I think is the largest contiguous empire ever existing in humanity, like reached
Wow.
from like China all the way through the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
And basically it was unbroken until I think it was the Black Plague.
Mm.
So all of a sudden their ability to trade and communicate and move things around really fast with the plague became a liability. Because
Mhm.
again, remember, we didn't know what germs were or things at that
Mhm.
time. So um, all of a sudden the disease was spreading, and so the cities became balkanized and cut off, and communication and trade, which was an asset before, became a liability.
Yeah.
So, but the Empire had a lot of new innovations
Yeah.
until then.
So I want to talk about the zeitgeist, like what's happening in the world in the news. So, lots of CEOs, Mark Zuckerberg, Evan Spiegel from Snap, have sort of changed, and we talked about this at the top, have sort of changed their tune on working from home. I feel at the start of the pandemic, everyone was work remotely, work distributed from home for forever. And now there are several big companies in the news who are saying, if you don't come back to the office, we're going to let you go. Where do you think remote work is heading? Do you think it's going to go, are we going to go back to the office, 80% of people? Are we going to go back to distributed? Where do you think it's going?
Well, yeah, I have been in some ways disappointed, in some ways excited that these companies are not just going back into the office, but in some cases going back on their word, meaning
Uh-huh.
that they promise their employees one thing and then change that. Um, if you're an employee, the good news is not just Automattic, but there's companies like GitLab. By the way, Stripe has fully committed to distributed work. Shopify has fully committed to distributed work. So some pretty impressive, hundreds of billions of market cap companies have committed to this. Um, the final thing is that I'll say, it's okay both ways.
Hmm.
So the great thing is, I think it's important that companies stick to what they promise. But, some companies are going to prefer in person, some companies are not. And the cool thing is some employees are going to prefer in person and some companies
Mhm.
employees will not. So I think there'll just be a sorting. Um, Absolutely the percentage of folks who work this way as a percentage of the total workforce, knowledge workforce, will continue to go up. I think that'll
Hmm.
be an inexorable trend or secular trend. But it's never going to be 100.
Mhm.
Also, some jobs that, like, if you're building hardware or something, might be very, very difficult to do a distributed way. I was just at Sonos, and I spoke with their CEO, to their employees, and they have really tried. They are committed to distributed. Um, Most of their employees were not in their office, but they're making amazing speakers. And
Yeah.
so, like, some of that hardware design and testing and everything did need to be in person. But also, as we walked around, some of those QA, they have the area where there's like 100 speakers plugged into things. They're testing like the auto updates and all that sort of stuff. That the employees, the workstation was active, but the employee was remote. They were logging in
Uh-huh.
remotely and working on it. I thought that was really cool. So there's but it's hard to have like what's the chamber called? I forget what the sound chamber is called, like aerobolic or something. Like, you can't have one of those in your home. They have like the
Right.
largest
Right.
one in the country, and so like you can't like build that at home. So yeah, and also one thing we forget about is hybrid. Sometimes people use to say like sometimes remote, sometimes in office, or home 2 days, at work 3 days.
Yeah.
We are also a hybrid organization in that we just let you be wherever you want for 48 weeks out of the year. But four
Mhm.
weeks of the year, we say, hey, you're going to need to travel and go to a meetup or go to a conference
Mhm.
or go to something where you're spending time in person with your colleagues. Because what people often miss about our message isn't that in person isn't important. It's just it's that 48-4. Other companies want you in the office 48 weeks
Mhm.
and be wherever for 4 weeks of vacation. We say, okay, we want you like wherever you want for 48 weeks and then somewhere specific for 4 weeks. But it's important. And actually, something we learned in hiring was to set those expectations,
Mhm.
because gosh, what? You need to build that into your salary, that maybe like you need a cat sitter or
Yep.
childcare or something like that for 3 or 4 weeks out of the year. So, because we don't pay for that. So like you need to build
Mhm.
it into your total compensation calculation.
Mhm.
And so it's actually, I think, on all our hiring pages, like, hey, 3 or 4 weeks of travel per year.
Fantastic. Matt, I know you are out of time, so I just want to say thank you so much for joining us and for sharing all of your insights and wisdom. So thank you.
I really enjoyed it. And also, Patrick, thank you for everything you do in the WordPress community. Like, I really appreciate it.
Huh. Thank you. I appreciate that. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, hit the like button and subscribe to get those algorithms channeling traffic to our YouTube channel. If you're on the Plugin.fm website, be sure to hit the subscribe button for early bird access to our future content. Or just share the episode on your social media accounts so that we can get the word out there and help fellow entrepreneurs like you. Plugin.fm is brought to you by Freemius, your all-in-one payments, subscription, and taxes platform for selling software, plugins, themes, and software as a service. If you're struggling to grow your software revenue, send a note to contact@freemius.com to get free advice from Freemius's monetization experts. My name is Patrick Rollins, and thanks for listening to Plugin.fm.